Hope you have joined with a good cuppa because the next session is a fireside chat. And for this, I welcome two faces from the Indian science communication community who have been leading initiatives and conversations from the front. Please welcome Subhra Priyadarshini, the Chief Editor of Nature India, whose list of skill sets and specialities runs into pages perhaps ranging from editorial, journalism, science and technology, writing, editing, commissioning, blogging, portal management, social media, science networking, photography, to special print projects. She has played a pivotal role in establishing the Science Journalist Association of India, which was launched recently. She's one of the founding members of SJAI, where she intends to create a professional peer body of science journalists, communicators, and writers in India. Welcome, Subhra. Lovely to have you with us today. And joining us in picture is Siddharth Kankaria, Communications and Program Manager at NCBS Bangalore. He is also the founder of the SciComm Club, a flagship initiative for engaging with the science of science communication. Siddharth spends his time exploring the research practice communium within science communication, contributing to mentorship, capacity building efforts, and developing intersectional science engagement practices for the global South. He's passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Welcome, Siddharth. So pleased to have you with us today. This is going to be a super informal conversation where I huddle with Subhra and Siddharth to discuss the business of science communication and how we can get better at what we do at our craft by joining forces. So please feel free to jump into the conversation by sharing your comments, your thoughts, your questions with us in the chat box. I promise to keep an eye out for them in the chat box, and I'll bring you in whenever it's possible. So let's begin. Now, I think I think someone said, I can't remember who said that, but good seasons, or rather good journeys, start with always good beginnings. So I would really like to start this conversation on a very exciting or a happy note. And that would, for me, be if you both look at the science communication scene in India today, what is it that really excites you? Maybe we can start with Subhra. Would you like to go first?
Thank you, Banya, and thank you for that glorious introduction as well. And I'm happy that we are not having a PPT kind of a session, so that we can just chat and have some conversation around things that are important to us and things that we feel are close to our hearts. Thank you for that question as well, for opening. I do think this science communication field in India, it's a many splendored landscape, certainly, and has place for everybody, considering, the kind of demographics we have and the kind of, vastness of resources that this country itself can produce. So I do think that there's space for not just everyone, but also immense possibility for cross-fertilization of thoughts and symbiosis, like you pointed out. Let me come to it from the journalism world's point of view. Journalists are notorious. They're notoriously known to view the rest of the communication world as propaganda driven many times. But there's, they think that there's some agenda always when institutions are communicating, or there's institutional communication exists for some sort of a covert reason that they don't know and they want to unravel all the time. That's the prevalent view. But unfortunately, for ages, the joke in newsrooms has been that if you switch from journalism to communication or PR, you are sort of switching over to the dark side, or from a vocation to a profession. Thankfully, thankfully, or not maybe, all of these are now professions. Nobody is in a vocation anymore. Neither are journalists nor are science communicators, which is great. And I think it opens up a huge bunch of possibilities for all of us in our individual cocoons, and then coming together as you say, a community of practice, or individual communities of practice. So I personally think, once a journalist, you render yourself unemployable anywhere else because of this sense of entitlement and inflated ego kind of thing. So enough. I'm going to make lots of enemies today in my own sphere. So the scene, what I'm trying to say is the scene has evolved, and this may be purely anecdotal from my side, but I know that I get excellent quality press releases today, very high-end communication packages and events in India, which form the fodder for some of our best told stories in journalism as well. Well, the bad ones haven't totally gone away, but I don't spike an institutional press release anymore today without looking at it, which was not the case a few years ago. Also, there's a lot of, like I said, cross-fertilization of science communication and journalism today, and that kind of practice has its place under the sun. Communication, like I keep saying, remains a subset of journalism, after all, But I think Siddharth will be able to tell us more about whether someone has studied the scene in India to see how this overlap is working today as opposed to how it was 5 years or 10 years back. Siddharth?
Right. Thank you, Subhra, for that question. I'll come to it in a minute. First of all, thank you so much for having me, Banya, Sara, and Shruti. I'm very happy to be here and to be in conversation with this community of science communicators and public engagement people in India. And I think that is very much the topic of discussion for today. So very happy to be amongst this wonderful community. To answer Banya's question first, about what I think excites me the most about science communication in India, I think I can think of many things, but perhaps the most important thing I would say is the diversity aspect. So India is a country of it's a potpourri of diversity in every way and every sense of the word, right? Be it our culture, our languages, and where we come from, the food we eat, the things we wear, the diversity of opinion also, I would say. So in that perspective, from that way, I think the diversity of people who are in the science communication system, as Subhra also pointed out, is truly what's really exciting. There are so many entry points into SciComm, and there are so many sort of destinations in SciComm that I can think of today. And it's literally a multicosm of things coming in and coming out. And there is so much magic and wonder that happens there, right? So I can see people who come into SciComm from science, from humanities, from social sciences, from arts, from culture, from social work. There are so many entry points into SciComm. And on the other hand, there's so many exit points or so many destinations or ways of doing and knowing in SciComm. That is really exciting because there is so much that we can learn from each other that we can do together. And that kind of sort of helps me segue into Subhra's question of how things are. I just wanted to repeat your question. You wanted to ask how things have changed in the last few years. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, I was wondering if somebody has actually put their minds to do a study on how things were, say, 5 years back, this give and take between our communities was, right, and how we are poised today. Because I find it exceptionally, brewing in terms of what kind of thoughts are being borrowed from, say, the communication field into journalism or into public engagement of science. So yeah, go on.
I absolutely agree with you. I think there's a lot of interesting things that are happening. So when I joined the field a couple of years ago, SciComm was, as an organized field of engagement or of a profession, was just starting to sort of coagulate and categorize. I mean, mind you, science communication and public engagement in India has been happening for centuries. I mean, what we mean by traditionally science communication is this organized sense of the field that is a more global perspective of science communication. That's really happened only in the last decade. And initially, there was a lot of issues in terms of how do we fund SciComm, who pays for it, and how do we do it, where do we get trained, how do we even convince scientists to sort of understand that it's important to do it and engage in something which, in terms of time and resources and money. But I think in the last 10 years or so that I have been seeing things, I think things have changed very, very dramatically. There is so much of cross-fertilization, as Subhra said, of ideas, of approaches, of people, of context, of experiences. And what's really interesting that's happening is that a lot of people who did not consider them as science communicators, who were sort of working in the remote villages or different contexts, are really coming into their own and sort of talking about how they can sort of be a part of this larger science communication movement in the country, and how they can sort of learn. So I can give you an example. I mean, we all know of Kulagala. Kulagala is someone who has been doing his podcast and has been doing a lot of science communication in Kannada, but he also does a lot of translations where he just takes science communication outputs in English and in other languages and just translates them, or sort of features people who write science communication or journalists and talks about them in the podcast, right? And that's another way of sort of combining and sort of, instead of reinventing the wheel, we sort of lean on each other and make things better and make things, more suitable to the context that we're trying to do. So yeah, there's a lot happening, and I hope that we can get into sort of a little bit more of it towards our discussion today. So I'll stop with that. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe I just wanted to add something to this from a very personal point of view. So when I started in science communication, I didn't start in science communication. I had to take like a long flight of stairs to come to science communication, just because information was not accessible then. I mean, we just had to struggle to find enough information, and it was not out there for everybody to see what is happening, and it was mostly boxed. And today what we see, as both of you have rightly pointed out, that there is so much out there, there is so much crosstalk happening, there is so much of cross learning happening between the communities. That's absolutely like exciting. It's like a perfect place to be right now to build that framework, if we want to build one, from where we can start looking at a more organized enterprise of science communication. And with that, I think that what I also want to bring into this conversation is how we have realized that when we talk about science communication as an enterprise, it's actually multiple groups with like varied expertise coming together. As a science communicator, if you say I'm a science communicator, you may be writing about science, you may be doing podcasts, you may be drawing science, making illustrations. So there is this combination of expertise that comes into play when we are talking about science communication today, and especially science engagement today. So, Siddharth, what do you think about it? Or so, Subhra?
Right. Thank you for that wonderful question. I think it's very easy to demarcate us and sort of divide us based on what approach or what format of science communication. So journalism versus podcast versus multimedia versus writing versus research institutions, public engagement activities. It's easy to do that, but we need to understand that there is so much of the underlying principles and approaches and ways of doing things that is actually common across all of these. So, for example, the idea of simplifying science or removing jargon to make science more simple, or using metaphors and analogies, or using a narrative or a storytelling aspects are actually something that you can see across all the formats, whether it's audiovisual, whether it's journalism, whether it's institutional communication. Aspects of using metaphors, of using narratives, of simplifying science, of making science more accessible is something that cut across all formats and approaches. So we must remember that these different forms of science communication are different approaches and formats, but to be a science communicator is, I would define a science communicator. Again, I don't really want to use technical terms, but I would define science communicator as anyone who is sort of bringing together different groups of people and helping them exchange knowledge, experiences, and values and belief systems. And I think a person who's enabling people, or two groups of people or two individuals, to sort of understand each other's point of view in terms of what knowledge they have and what context and what experiences they are bringing to the table is what a science communicator is. And this definition, or this way of looking at a science communicator, actually does not need embellishments or format or approach. It's just fundamentally what a science communicator does is to actually enable conversations and exchange of knowledge and experiences, right? So I think that is one way of sort of understanding that there's so much common in between us, and also because that we can learn from each other so much, which I think is an important discussion point for today. So I'll stop at that and let Subhra continue.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the commonality is something that has yet not been sort of explored too much. All we have looked at is the differences till now. What we have seen is, okay, science journalist, all right. So you are going to speak truth to power. You're going to question authority. So that's different for me. My identity sort of comes from the fact that I can question, I can make science communication go one step further beyond just communicating the rigors or the niceties of science or the breakthrough kind of stuff, to going and making those breaking news kind of stories where you have all kinds of things like scandals, you have questioning policy, you question people in science, etc. So that's great, but that is not my sole identity. And that's the difference, like I said, from you or the science engagers or the communicators or even people who sort of just are translating science into various other languages or transcribing science into various formats, whatever it is. So I think instead of we all know the differences. There's no sort of making a case for that. But we ought to now get to know the similarities, and that's where I think there is a reason for cheer and a lot of scope for growth. And that's what I would think. That's
Banya, if I can just add 2 points to what Subhra said. I mean, it sort of triggered my thinking. So one thing that Subhra mentioned was about questioning things, and I want to comment on that based on saying that the job or the role of a science communicator is not just to disseminate information or to sort of share findings of a research output or study. It's also to sort of enable people to think for themselves. It's to enable skepticism. It's to enable questioning things, as Subhra mentioned. Science communication can also be a way of questioning science and the process of science itself, right? For example, I can tell you a lot of science communicators in India are very, very passionate about inclusivity and diversity and themes like that, right? Including myself. And what that incorporates or what that involves is actually questioning the processes and norms of science to ask, who does science? Who is science meant for? Who is benefiting from science, right? And that is actually something a lot of journalists also do. It's their job is also to question and hold a mirror to things, right? And so in that way, I think the conceptualization of who a science communicator is, of what their role is sort of partially limited in India, because we think of science communicators as people who share knowledge or who broker knowledge. But in reality, and often science communicators do this without realizing that themselves, right? They often question things. They often ask things to be more inclusive. They often think about inclusivity concerns. And another thing that I want to say, that a lot of science communicators in India, especially, science communicators are thought of as someone who are secondary to the process of doing science, as someone who take a product of science and then help translate it or disseminate it. But in reality, science communicators can themselves be also producers of knowledge. And this knowledge does not have to be restricted to science. This knowledge can be very much about how to communicate science, but also help science come up with more questions or hypotheses to test, right? So I can tell you many examples of science communication which have actually fed back to the process of science and given them questions to sort of take forward, right? Or which have sort of highlighted concerns of people that are on the ground and scientists may not be really connected with them. And they take it back to the people and force scientists or the enterprise of science to either acknowledge those concerns or actually develop research questions or methods or studies which actually take into account the concerns of people and solve real life problems, right? So the science communicator is not just transferring knowledge from one way to the other. It's also taking concerns of people and bringing it back to the scientists. And I think that's something that's very important for us to realize in terms of what is the role of a science communicator, right? And the other thing that I wanted to talk about that Subhra mentioned was that she does not identify with a particular aspect of science communication. And I think it's also important to remember, I'll make it short, it's also important to remember that there's a lot of intersectionality in terms of who scientists are, who science communicators are, but most importantly, who our audiences are. And we can talk about this intersectionality a little bit later. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Yeah, and this is what a wonderful conversation is all about, right? Triggering thought. So I think you triggered something in me, Siddharth, and that is that, very often it's said that journalism is not original per se. We are producing what some other people have already discovered or said or done, and we're just stating facts. We aren't producing something really original, apart from the words that we weave them into. So probably it's just the same, and that's how, many times the thoughts from a journalistic piece might actually go back into informing science the way it is being done. And so, yeah, you're very right in saying that communication in any format or form is basically, I was also listening to the previous speakers and how beautifully they are also synergizing art and science, and how art is feeding into science and how science is feeding into art. And all of this as a whole then becomes such a cherishable and wonderful sort of activity, and feeding into each other's domains and learning from each other. So I think, again, that's a massive trigger for me to take back from today's conversation.
I can see that Somdatta has shared a beautiful thought with us. Somdatta, would you like to come in here? Just unmute yourself.
Hi. Yeah.
Hey, hi.
Yeah. I mean, so I often think that maybe the defining feature of a science communicator is one who stands for the non-science audience instead of communicating for the sake of those in science. So when I'm creating content representing the non-science audience, my agenda automatically changes, because I think everybody has an agenda anyway. There's no denying to it. So then what agenda am I picking is probably going to define this bright side of SciComm versus the dark side of SciComm.
I don't know if I got the question right, Somdatta, but I think exactly so. I think all of us who communicate science are standing for our audiences rather than for the people who we are doing this for. So I don't do it for, say, my employer, or you don't do it exactly for your employer. Many times we do, but most times the noble thought behind all of that we do is probably the people we serve, the communities we serve. So yeah, I do agree with that thought. And the cliched example of how you bring it down to the level of a class 10 student or your grandma has long passed. We've gone past that for a long time, and we sort of now know that there is a reason why we weave narratives or storytelling into everything that we do. And that's precisely why at the heart of every wonderful science communication approach is a story. And I do agree with what you said, that you look at a science communicator as somebody who's standing for their audiences rather than standing for the other agenda-driven societies.
Can I just add one quick point to Somdatta's question? So I think there is, while I agree with Somdatta and Subhra to a large extent, I have one sort of piece of contention, is that there is a huge risk for science communicators to sort of speak for the communities that they're communicating or engaging with, and to sort of assume that we represent them in a way that we know what's best for them, and to sort of say that, okay, this is going to be accessible to certain communities. And we really need to be careful about not sort of assuming this God complex that we know what the communities want. It's very, very important to sort of include the communities and give them a sense of agency, and if possible, actually co-develop something with them so that they can actually benefit from what we are doing. It's very easy to design something that we think would be useful and to do it and have people attend our talks, but actually not have any impact at all, right? So in order to make sure that our science communication is actually impactful and meaningful to the communities we are engaging with, it's very, very important to engage and consult with the communities, and in some ways, if possible, also make them participate in the design and development of the science communication. It could just be speaking to them for an hour. It doesn't have to be a very complicated process, right? But it's important to engage them and give them a sense of agency so that they know what's useful to them and what we produce is actually meaningful, rather than us deciding that this is going to be useful for them and sharing it with them. So I just want to sort of leave with this piece of advice, because this is something that I have seen and I've done myself when I was a few years ago, and I've realized that it's very important to sort of give communities a sense of agency also in terms of when we do public engagement. Right? So.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with Siddharth here, because when we not move away from science communication, but when you get into engagement with science, then at the heart of every public engagement project is the community. You bring them as co-owners of the project and you co-create with them. So it's basically like empowering them to ask the right questions and to be able to use the information that you are providing them or they are using for themselves. So again, a community is at the heart of all such projects. And also one quick response to what Somdata had shared. When a science communicator is communicating, of course, we are communicating with the audience, but they are not non-science audience necessarily, because one of the important aspects in a science communicator's life is also research in science communication, which I think Siddharth can elaborate more on that. And most of the times, this research on science communication is very, very valuable to the researchers or to the scientists who can enhance their work through the findings of this research. Siddharth, would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a very, very pertinent point that you raised, Banya, and Somdata, of course, that often in science communication, we are really, really focused on external communication, but we don't really think about internal and intra-communication. And it's very important to sort of enable communication platforms, opportunities, activities, initiatives, whatever it is called, for scientists themselves to communicate with each other, right? And to communicate with communities, of course, that are being affected by the science. But we are reaching sort of the frontiers of knowledge where it's not possible for us to, make insightful discoveries on our own. It is, but those are smaller discoveries. So in this age of collaboration and open science and having more interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches, it is very, very crucial that scientists, experts, I wouldn't say scientists, I would say experts, because experts could be doctors, they could be policymakers. So I would use a more broader term, which is experts. Experts, we should really, really focus on facilitating conversations and communication and engagement between different forms of expertise and also different forms of experience, because it's important for us to understand that. So I'll give a short example. So if you are a patient living with a medical condition, and say, for example, diabetes, right? So a doctor has an understanding of diabetes, which is a medical understanding. A scientist might have a molecular or cellular biology understanding of diabetes and how it happens. But a person living with diabetes also has an understanding of what the condition is and how to deal with it on a day-to-day basis, right? And if we have to design science which is meaningful and effective, it's very important that I'm not saying that all these forms of expertise are equal to each other, but all these forms of expertise of the patient living with the condition, of the doctor and of the scientist must be sort of taken together and listened to and heard for us to come to a point where we can actually develop something that's meaningful for the patient living with diabetes, right? So in order for acknowledging and respecting that patient's experience of living with a medical condition is equally important when we are doing public engagement, as it is important to listen to a doctor or a scientist, right? And it is this awareness and acknowledgement of people's experiences that actually are really important. That respect and acknowledgement is what can actually make science communication impactful and meaningful, right? So that's how I will say. So in terms of internal communication, even scientists and doctors and experts within themselves really need to be able to understand and engage with each other and respect and acknowledge each other's point of view, because it's only when we start listening to and working with people together, building a community of practice together, that we can really reach a place where we can make new and novel discoveries and insights and push science further, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing, let me play the devil's advocate here. Which is my job. Let me say that, yeah, I agree to what you're saying, Siddharth and Somdata and Banya. One thing is, many times, for example, in times of a pandemic, there's very less what should I say, return time overall to design a project. In your case, a story. In my case, to create something of value for our audiences. The turnaround time is pretty low, and in these times, you sort of, from your years of experience of what the audiences might want in a similar situation elsewhere, in a precedence that you already have had, and bring in those pointers, bring in that experience and create a program, a project for them, which took you, say, 10 hours or 5 hours, and execute it in the next 2 hours. And that's how sharp many times our deadlines are as communicators. So I think there's merit in sort of the comfort of having that time and having that engagement with your audiences when you can. But there are situations also where probably you might not have that luxury of going to and fro with the community and your audience, and then you have to then fall back on what has been the best practice or the best lessons learned from a similar story or project before, and then you implement those in your communication strategy. So I think it works both ways. It could work this way, it could work that way as well. The only thing that, of course, we all need to be aware of, perhaps, is that we do not force any communication down the gullet of our communities that we are serving. So it could be my audiences, it could be certain patients with diabetes, it could be whoever we are sort of looking at as our audience. So I think it does work both ways, given the limitations and the format and the overall turnaround time, which is something really big for people in my practice.
I just want to respond to that very quickly, that I absolutely agree with you that in certain situations, the turnaround time, especially in journalism, is very, very tight. But there are ways to build in reflexibility. For example, I'm sure most journalists have trusted sources that, and the relationship with those sources have been developed over years and years of, communication, right? And so in terms of, in situations where you have very little turnaround time, it is these trusted sources that you reach out to, because they are in some ways a form of engaging the community and getting sure that you are not the only one making the narrative, but you're actually getting quotes from people who can comment on it, right? And similarly, once you publish something, there's also a lot of reflexivity where people can give feedback, people can write comments to the editor. So I completely agree with you, Subhra, and I think that engaging the community and getting their feedback can happen in multiple ways. It can also happen after the communication has been done, when we have a little bit of more luxury with time. But in for example, in the pandemic situation, I completely agree that things had to be done quickly. But I think what could have been done better was the acknowledgement that this is still work in progress, that the science is still evolving, that there is uncertainty, and we'll keep updating you as and when we know more information. This was implicit in a lot of ways, but I think this could have been included within the communication messages a little bit better, because that would have actually led to a greater trust in science and not caused so many of the controversies that we had. And I think that's another debate for another day.
Actually, you're opening a Pandora's box.
Yes, I'll leave it at that.
And I do know that this has really been one of the things that we have debated through the pandemic, the uncertainty, the imponderables of our communication, and how to really make that effective. And also the fact that science itself was communicated in such tough language, is communicated in such tough language versus miscommunication, which is handed over to you in such wonderful language and videos and formats that you just grasp that first and pass it on.
Misinformation is always more tempting and more convincing, right? I mean, that's also true. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, we'll go over to the next one before Banya says enough of you guys.
No, I won't say that I'm loving this conversation, but sadly we have just 5 to 7 minutes.
Oh gosh.
I think that we should now maybe discuss the community of practice that we wanted to discuss in this conversation. And Subhra, I will come to you for that, because you have recently launched the association in India. So could you just share your experience with us, and how has it been, and how do you see this community growing in India, being more inclusive, and just helping foster collaborations for better science communication?
Surely, Banya. Thanks for that question. I think this is historic, what I'm going to discuss now. So the Science Journalists Association, and you heard it here first, the Science Journalists Association of India actually has been in the making for the last 3 years, and a bunch of us really got together. We've been trying to put it together for a while now. The pandemic has been a really tough time work-wise, and also in terms of trying to pull together an association, right? The idea of this association came from the growing number of science journalists and communicators in this country over the last 5-6 years, just by head counts. There are no studies which say the growth of science journalism or communication, but just pure head count. So when we compiled an initial list of practitioners in 2018-19, we counted almost 50 journalists writing either full-time or off and on science, health, environment, policy, all through the lens of science. In English, and like Siddharth mentioned, the example of regional languages, so various Indian languages. And besides, we also counted almost that kind of number, like 50-ish, for professionals in science communication dedicatedly doing that. It was institutional communicators, public relations officers, science engagement professionals, then scientists who very keenly pursue communication. They're not communicators, but they are way better than many communicators I know. So those kinds of professionals, then Indian scientists and science communicators and journalists working outside India. That's also another category we are also pondering about. So obviously we went around asking if there's a need for an association like this, and every country with serious science journalists has one. So that was the thought we came to it from. And I've been part of the World Federation of Science Journalists on a personal level, and have been asked many, many times by the Federation why such a thriving ecosystem like India does not have an association, So on the prodding of one of our young science journalist friends, Dinsa Sachan, I want to take the names, and of course, endless work and immense support of another leading science journalist, Virat Markandeya, we started looking at the possibility of creating the association. Virat's father, actually, Mr. Subodh Markandeya, he's a very, very well-known, respected legal luminary of this country, and we started taking his counsel. His support and the encouragement of almost 30 science journalists that came across, who actually built a case for this association. So it's worth mentioning here that this was absolutely not an easy process, because primarily societies were not being allowed by the Delhi government at that point of time. We actually had to challenge it in court first. We actually had to win a war, a battle, legal battle, so to say, to create this association. So that's why this is historic. We were the first society to be formed after we won that legal case in the court. So I'm saying all of this because it is necessary for everyone to understand that though the intentions to create such an association or a community of practice, so to say, might be very noble, but there are very big challenges, legal challenges. There are problems thrown open by the pandemic itself. There's even the daily demanding grind as professionals that all of us go through, right? And so coming together as an association was a work of a lot of sweat. So right now we're putting together all our administration, stuff like bank accounts, membership forms, eligibility criteria, all of that. And we'll hopefully be able to sort of bring everyone interested into the fold of the association in the first quarter of 2022. Now, this community is for journalists and associate members, which include science communicators, engagement professionals, outreach professionals, public relations officers, students and academics of science communication or journalism. And we are thinking how we can also be more inclusive and bring in Indian science journalists or communication professionals who are not in India. The catch here is that legally, for a society registered in India, it is binding to have members who are Indian and are working inside India. And but we are taking legal counsel on that one, advice on that one, and we'll figure out a way very shortly. I just want to mention and end by saying that diversity and inclusion are really at the heart of all that SJI would be doing in future, and we'll do everything possible to take everyone along in this journey as much as is humanly and association-wise possible.
Thank you, Subhra. And I would like Siddharth to just come in here and maybe share a couple of benefits of community of practice with us for the closing, like if
Sure.
And maybe some examples very quickly.
Right. So I think I'm part of a couple of communities of practice. One, of course, being my own SciComm Club, which I started 2 years ago, but also the PCST Forum, whose president right now, Jenny, was a panelist earlier today, and Marina is also a very active member of that. Also, Conciliance Journal. So I'm part of a couple of global communities of practice, and I can tell you from my experience there, that there are a lot of benefits that we can get by just being in a community of practice. So the first and foremost being that we really learn by doing, and we don't really need to reinvent the wheel ourselves. Often it's much easier to sort of learn from people who are doing certain things which we are interested in but may not have the time to do. So for example, as Subhra mentioned, diversity and inclusion aspects, learning different formats of science communication. During COVID, we often moved to a digital platform for doing science communication, and a lot of people were better equipped to do that as compared to some other people. So being in a community of practice can really be helpful for sort of training and building capacity and teaching each other and mutual learning from each other. But it can also help us to come together and organize things, as Subhra's SAI is an example. So it can also be a driving force for building infrastructure, for asking for funding. And this is something that last year the Science Policy Forum and SciComm Club were very, very sort of involved in building a science policy, a science communication policy for India. And that's something we really highlighted there, was that we really need more sort of interactions and engagements and cross-fertilization between different science communication engagements of all hues and colors. And it's very important for building infrastructure and capacity from that point of view. So yeah, I think those are some of the benefits of having a community of practice. Mentorship and career development and networking would definitely be another very, very important sort of benefit. There's a lot that we can learn from each other, and mentorship does not always mean a senior person mentoring a younger person. Mentorship can be sort of multi-directional, and we can all learn from each other. So I think that's about it, and I think I'll stop at that. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Siddharth and Subhra, for sharing those insights with us and for joining us today. It was lovely having you with us today.